Great. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us. I see some folks filtering into the room. So we'll give you a second here to get situated and to get your bearings, find yourself again in the platform, and then we'll get started here. Alrighty. So without further ado, let's kick it off. So we are having our very first panel of the conference for our very first week, Economic Security Week. This is Economic Security as National Security. And just to give some brief bios here, or brief background for our stellar panel this morning, we are joined today by Taylor Jo Isenberg. She's the Executive Director of the Economic Security Project. She was previously the Senior Advisor to the CEO and President and Vice President of the National Network at the Roosevelt Institute, which is an organization that works to redefine the rules and guide our social and economic realities. She also served as the chair, she serves as the chair of the board of directors for the Scallywag magazine, which is a publication which advances social justice through the South's diverse thinkers, which sounds really interesting. I'll have to take a look into that. And she's also a Forbes 30 Under 30 for Law and Policy in 2015, and a Fusion 30 Under 30 Women in Shaping Politics in 2016. So hello to you, Taylor. We've got Mandy Smithberger, who's the director of the Center for Defense Information with the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO. Mandy rejoined POGO as the director of the Center for Defense Information in 2014. So she's been there quite a while, about 7 years. She previously was a national security policy advisor to U.S. Representative Jackie Speer, and previously an investigator with POGO before she rejoined in 2014. Mandy is an expert on national security, Pentagon reform, and the defense industry revolving door. She's appeared on CNN, Fox News, and NPR, and has been cited in multiple outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Reuters, Politico, and Foreign Policy. Hello to you, Mandy. And last but not least, we have Sarah Hassmer, who's the Senior Counsel for Income Security at the National Women's Law Center. Sarah works on the center's agenda to advocate for policies to increase economic security for low-income women, children, and families. Her portfolio includes federal and state tax policy, federal anti-poverty programs like food and housing assistance, and the 2020 census. Prior to joining the Law Center, the National Women's Law Center, she worked for the Office of Personnel Management for over 6 years, where she created a new government program, the lab at OPM, and focused on using human-centered design to design policy programs and experiences responsive to people's needs. So hello, Sarah, and thank you for joining. All right, so to kick us off, as you've been hearing so far this morning with Nancy and with Gail's great opening remarks, we're holding this summer to explore a more human-centered approach to national security, one that will consider social and economic issues as key components of security. So for the past several years, risks to our economy, healthcare system, our critical infrastructure, and democracy have tested our ideas of national strength, safety, and national security. And we saw the coronavirus pandemic infect millions of Americans, took the lives of nearly 700,000 people, devastating families and communities. The resulting economic crisis led to a record loss of more than 22 million jobs, skyrocketing unemployment insurance claims, and a childcare crisis and mass exodus of women from the workforce. Driven by the childcare problems created by the pandemic, women have fallen out of the labor force in record numbers, and workers lack support when welcoming a new child or caring for a loved one. For too long, national security has been synonymous with military action. As we broaden the national security lens, we can begin to see that defending our country, ideals, and citizens go beyond just these traditional restraints or thinking of security. It's time to recognize that human security is the bedrock on which national security is built. As women, state legislators play an important role in ensuring that communities are secure in their health, housing, and dignity. Exploring ways in which the federal investment could boost local economies is essential to rebuilding our communities post-COVID. So with that, I want to invite our panelists to each give a minute of opening remarks, and then we'll go into directed questions for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we will open it up for Q&A from the audience. If you're just joining us, I want to point out to the right-hand side, there is the chat function. So you can chat with each other and scroll around to see other information pertaining to the conference in the chat box. And you can also pose your Q&A or questions for Q&A in the Q&A chat. So why don't we open up and start with Taylor? I've got you first on the screen for opening remarks.
Hi there. First, thank you so much for having me. I've long known of Will's work and I'm a huge fan, so I'm grateful to be a part of this conversation. So I think the place I would start, I think the organizing principle of this conference, human security is national security. At the heart of it is a organizing intellectual paradigm for how we think about the world that we are trying to build. In the same way that we think about budgets as moral documents, values and frameworks really shape the choices that we make on a day-to-day basis. So I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about the economic paradigm that we have been operating in for the past 40 plus years. There is long been a push to tell a story around the economy, that it just happens, that markets just work, that there is an invisible hand that just make things happen. And I think what the moment we are in is there is a real challenge to that paradigm and to that belief. But instead, markets are actually structured. The question is for who? Systems are built. The question is who do they work on behalf of? And there is a real opportunity for us to seize that and really ask the question of who do our systems show up for? So in the same way that we are asking that question on the national security front, it is also a question that's being asked when it comes to our economic systems as well. I think with what you're seeing right now is post the American Rescue Plan, there was a fundamental shift in this. We saw a plan that ultimately lowered poverty, that delivered millions of aid to people, and made a tremendous difference in people's ability to put food on the table. But it also really showcased the fragility of our system. The fact that people were that vulnerable in the first place, that we had to be scrambling in a way that wasn't still even really fast enough to support people. The fact that our supply chains were so weak. Those didn't just happen. Those were intentional choices. They're intentional policies put in place, and we can make different ones. And I think that's really what we're talking about here today, and I'm excited to dig into in the conversation.
Great, awesome. Thank you so much, Taylor. I'm gonna scroll with Mandy.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so excited for this conversation to kind of dovetail into what Taylor was talking about. I think it's important to look at the fact that the Department of Defense was largely irrelevant when we were going through the pandemic, that in many ways they were not helping to lead us in these efforts, even though we have given them a disproportionate amount of budget resources, that it didn't make us safer, it didn't enhance our national security. And in one case where Congress gave them $1 billion to try and help with increasing our capacity for PPE, they decided to just give that money to the defense industry for other stuff that was absolutely irrelevant to the pandemic. So I think one of the things I'm hoping that we will talk about today is the importance of accountability, and that the most patriotic thing that you can do in national security in any arena is to hold people accountable and to expect them to be transparent and honest with the American people about what they're doing with our resources, and that we need to challenge them when they misuse those resources. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And Sarah, let's close it up or wrap it up.
Again, thank you so much for having me on this exciting panel today. It's a very critical discussion. A common theme that we all had in this was how budgets are moral documents, as Taylor mentioned. And the federal budget shows the government's priorities. Meanwhile, the tax code sets rules for economy. It can exacerbate or mitigate income and wealth inequality. And we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity right now to raise the revenues to invest in women and families while advancing race and gender equity in the tax code. We know that years of public disinvestments in the supports women of color and women more generally need to live with economic dignity and succeed in this economy meant that women have essentially been functioning as the safety net. We saw during this pandemic how our safety net programs really don't have that much of a safety net. And so women have been the center of that. But really, women are past the breaking point. As you kind of alluded to, Rikkia, over 1.6 million women were pushed out of the labor force since February 2020. School closures, quarantines, and ongoing precarity in the childcare sector means that women are continuing to experience a slow and uneven economic recovery. And these underlying vulnerabilities in our economy won't be fixed without transformational structural investments that center the needs of women of color and women more generally. Also, to the point of what is security, our nation is more secure when everyone has secure housing. We have been in an eviction crisis for years, particularly impacting Black women and their families. Evictions disrupt families' lives, children's learning and development, but they also have ripple effects of harm in our communities. Keeping people housed also is much more cost efficient and effective for everyone than having to run and support programs that support unhoused people. And so we're at a pivotal moment for showing where our nation's priorities lie, with women and families or the wealthy and big corporations. I look forward to digging into these issues much deeper. Thank you.
Great. Yes, the chat is kind of going off, getting some love there. 100% agree with all of you, with what all you've said. So I really appreciate you kicking that off and helping us to help set the frame here. So I want to actually start with you, Mandy, and picking up really on what you were just talking about. You know, as a nation, our idea of national security is largely about national defense. And defending the country, you know, from attack, despite wasteful Pentagon spending and repeated failed audits. And you know, Congress will spend, will spend spare no expense, to invest in the military. While we're seeing, right, the fight play out on Congress, the lamenting about fiscal responsibility when it comes to passing sweeping social and economic reforms. So I want to ask you, what reforms would you like to see to reduce wasteful Pentagon spending, and how can state legislators hold the federal government accountable in doing that?
It's a great question. And for folks to know, you know, our approach is we really look at these issues in a pretty traditional defense frame. So even holding the Department of Defense accountable on its own terms, it's really wasting a lot of money a lot of the time. So I think there are kind of three areas that we really need to focus on. It's what's driving this kind of endless spending. One is corruption. I think it's really important for us to understand that we have a system of laws that does not protect the integrity of our spending processes, that we have a revolving door of senior Pentagon officials and congressional staff going to lobby for defense contractors that they should be overseeing, that they should be holding accountable, and that we need to be strengthening these laws at the federal level in the way that many states are strengthening them, because we understand that this is what we need to do to make sure we are accountable. Second, we need to just look at the top line. And by that, I mean, we need to lower it. We're not going to have any kind of reform unless we bring the Pentagon's budget down. Recently, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said it's ridiculous for taxpayers to think that we couldn't defend this nation at $700 billion a year. But we are on a trajectory of such waste that you are going to soon see proposals for us to be spending $1 trillion a year just on the Department of Defense, and that's bonkers. And finally, I think we need to look at our endless wars and where Congress really needs to be stepping up to hold them accountable. So there were a number of members who just took some very tough votes on cutting the budget by 10%, by cutting the budget on $25 billion. I think it's important to reinforce those lawmakers who have done that and to hold accountable those who voted the wrong way. And I think it's also important that all of us, it's very important to think about the needs of our community, but we can't let parochialism obscure the big picture, which is that we need to make sure that we have resources that are serving everyone and that we are not continuing to put defense corporations at the front of the line when there are so many others in need that are going to make us more resilient and more competitive for the future.
Hear, hear. Totally agree. Thank you for that. I am going to now come to you, Taylor. And, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, the pandemic forced millions of people out of work. Sarah mentioned this too. Businesses were forced to close, suspend operations. And so unemployment soared to 13%. We saw record numbers of unemployment insurance claims. Millions of households are still experiencing economic hardship, and the employment rate remains below pre-pandemic levels. So what kinds of programs should be in place at the federal and even maybe state level to provide financial stability for working families during periods of economic downturn?
Absolutely. So I think the main thing I would say is that there really is a lot to point to in the American Rescue Plan that worked extremely well for families. And I think it's worth noting, that plan didn't come out of nowhere. It's built up decades of work on the part of organizations and individuals to make the case that we need to show up and give it, not put our, as we had in previous downturns, hand the money over to the corporations who often contributed to that downturn, but directly into the hands of the people who are going to suffer the repercussions of these moments. So, the American Rescue Plan had everything, the pandemic unemployment insurance that expanded UI to people who otherwise would have not qualified. It provided the stimulus checks, 3 checks, which gave $3,200 roughly each to adults and $2,500 to kids. There was aid to small businesses. There's a ton to really specific policies to unpack on that. I think the piece that I want to focus on is the what of cash as one example, because that was a pretty defining aspect of this set of interventions. With both the stimulus checks, the expanded child tax credit, and the earned income tax credit, which are also both policies that do exist in various forms at the state level, we just gave people what they needed, which was money. And that money kept people in their homes. It put food on the table. And I think the kind of just to showcase how astounding the scale of the intervention was for the first time in years, the poverty rate actually dropped because of the scale of the intervention of putting money into people's pockets. The poverty rate fell to 8.5%, and particularly among the Black community, dropped from 20.4% to 12.1%, which had been 20 in 2018. This is significant, and it really just showcases that we can actually tackle these numbers. We can provide stability for families. We just have chosen not to. And I think part of the case we should make here is that we shouldn't wait for these hard moments. We shouldn't put people into precarious situations. These are policies that we can put in place. And that's really the fight that's happening right now too. I think with the reconciliation and with the package that the Biden administration is putting forward, going as big as possible as we can on that will make a huge difference for families, because in that is a tremendous amount of dollars that will continue to go to families to continue to see them and to provide stability and an income floor for them. Just to give one example, the child tax credit, one of the things that's been introduced as a permanent refundability, which would make sure the dollars are going to the families that need it most. A lot of people don't know is that a lot of these programs, the people at the lowest end, the lowest income individuals don't actually get these resources because we cut them out of the programs. And that was a big fix that we had and that we're fighting for to keep. I think, I would carve it out to say, kind of taking a step back, we really should be talking about those kinds of public investments, the ways that we're directly supporting families, the way we're doing that on a continual basis and not just in emergency moments. I also think it comes down to how we're structuring markets and regulation. I think this is really true when we think about and the big picture of human security as national security. We've let a lot of corporations get away with a lot of really bad mergers and restructurings that have made us fragile. And those have upstream or downstream impacts on families. Just to give 2 examples, more broadly, our economy has consolidated to the point the average American family is paying an additional $5,000 a year in extra costs because there is so little competition within markets. When the average, I think it's 40% of families can afford $400 in emergency, that puts that $5,000 in true perspective. That fragility both impacts families and also makes us more vulnerable on the international stage. We also see this in the defense industry. I think it was actually POGO who called it the Walmartization of the defense industry. We are seeing the consolidation, the lack of enforcement, the lack of true rigor in looking at mergers and the impact on our overall strength of our overall supply chains. very few options there, and that which in itself is driving up costs, and it's reinforced by the revolving door that Mandy mentioned in terms of who gets the contracts and what those contracts look like when there are so few options. So I think all of these things are really connected and go back to the fact of we can make different choices, and overall we've made choices that have made us more fragile, that have made families more fragile. And what it really comes down to is, again, as we're writing these rules, when what's happening in Congress, what's happening in states, the questions who we're writing them for, and right now we're not writing them for the first time. We have written them for people in a big way, and we need to continue to make that choice. And where we're still kind of not where we need to be, pushing harder and making sure we're working across public investments, across regulations, to make that the case.
Absolutely. 100% to everything. This is extremely exciting, but I think you're right. And you said some great things in there, and I really appreciate your comment on, just giving people what they really needed. I saw that too in some of my research. The Bureau of Labor Statistics actually cited that same thing, Taylor, that, during that period of time where folks were getting direct cash payments, poverty actually did fall. So that's, empirical evidence that this works. So Sarah, speaking of the Build Back Better Act, it includes, as was mentioned, right, several important provisions necessary to meet the needs of the American people and improve our economic outlook, including expanding certain tax credits for working families. So we know that women and people of color are boxed out of many other tax benefits that reward savings and wealth. Plus, low-income workers pay sales taxes, property taxes, and other regressive state taxes. How can we make taxes fairer for women and more progressive?
So we know that women supporting families on their own and households of color are underrepresented in higher income brackets and overrepresented in lower ones. And so women are more likely to have income from work than wealth. Only the wealthy can make a living from dividends or borrowing against their wealth. And so tax benefits that accrue to the top households really will leave women out. We need to double down on tax provisions, like as Taylor mentioned, the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit that we know work for women and families. And that will also increase racial and gender equity in the tax code. And we also know that the wealthy can pay their fair share. And if they do, that can help fund important critical investments in things like housing and clean energy and childcare and other aspects of the care infrastructure. And there are many ways that the wealthy can pay their fair share in taxes. Just two quick examples are raising the top income tax rates that were lowered in the 2017 Republican tax law, and also taxing income from wealth, like income from work. There's some inequity already baked into our tax system there. That would make our tax code fairer and more equitable for women and people of color. And so we are at this pivotal moment where we can actually make not just fixes to what happened in 2017 that made the tax code even more inequitable, but we can actually go further than that with more progressive tax policies that in turn might trickle down to some state tax economic issues as well.
Absolutely. Yes. I don't want to go on because I'm so excited. I can talk forever. I feel like we can have this conversation, but I do want to, there's some questions in the chat, and I also have a few other questions for you all. So let me get through these, and then we'll get to the chat. So last question I have for you, Mandy, at least, is, this last National Defense Authorization Act that passed the House includes an increase of about $25 billion above President Biden's funding request, right? Where in the budget are there opportunities for cost savings, and how can state legislators, encourage Congress to make these cuts in the next defense bill?
Great. So one thing, while we did not win on that vote, I do want people to realize that we have made a lot of progress. To have so many members of leadership supporting cuts to the Pentagon's budget is almost unheard of. So I want people to keep that in mind. And again, to thank those legislators who voted the right way on trying to reduce that increase. So I think there are a couple of major areas that we need to look at. One is our nuclear weapons spending. We you have many people who seem to want us to be in a new Cold War with China. This is not making us safer. This is not going to make us economically resilient. I think we really need to be reducing our nuclear weapons spending and challenging those programs and telling our members of Congress that we don't want to see that kind of endless spending continue. Another major pocket of money is looking at our over-reliance on service contractors. So that's outsourcing work that was done by civilian employees to white-collar workers for the most part. And in most cases, they are much more expensive than civilian employees are. There's much less scrutiny on whether do we even need someone to be doing this job at all or not. So through all of that, I think it's advocating for, we want to see a much lower budget, and we want Congress to stand behind the president when he offers a lower budget top line. I think it's important to make sure that we are making that message clear that the priorities of this administration are to build back human security, and that continuing to militarize all of our policy is not going to make us safer. I will take just one question from the chat. It would be wonderful to see resolutions on having a defense audit. They don't think it's going to happen until 2028. That is ridiculous. The rest of us are able to account for what we spend. There is bipartisan legislation in the Senate that it would be great to see more bipartisan support for, that there should be budget accountability when you can't pass an audit. Like, if the Social Security Administration can pass an audit, why can't the Department of Defense?
Absolutely. Yes, and thanks for grabbing Charlita's question, because it was something I was thinking or looking at too, right? Like, how is this something that we just can't get to happen? Yeah, and it seems like Congress doesn't actually have the willingness either to enforce that. So coming back around to you, Taylor. So the Economic Security Project talks about society taking a patriarchal approach to income security and, quote, dictating how, where, and on what terms individuals can build their lives, unquote. I was drawn to that because we believe, Will believes in a feminist approach to foreign policy and empowering women in security to advance ideals of peace and nonviolent solutions to conflict. Can you unpack your organization's stance on this a little bit?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's, to be honest, it's the reason. So just for a little context for folks, the Economic Security Project, we're aiming to build a world in which we believe everyone has the economic stability they need to thrive. And we've picked two fights we think will help get us there. One is for a guaranteed income for individuals and families, and the other is anti-monopoly action. So, which is essentially, if we believe if we're going to provide stability for families, we have to counter the power of those who've aggregated it at the top. So just to take a step back, this is really what drew me to the work on the guaranteed income. There is, when you look at the history of the social safety net in the United States, it is built on deeply racist and deeply classist and deeply sexist ideas around who is deserving in this country. And when you look at the bills that have passed and the systems that we've built, what it really comes down to, it says, is that, like, you don't deserve to put food on the table. You don't deserve to be stable. And that takes the form of work requirements, that takes the form of hours of bureaucracy, of standing in line to be able to get food stamps. It takes the form of denial, of people not being able to access their services. And it takes the form of vindictive legislators who make it even harder day in and day out. And that is a choice that we are making. And the people who suffer the most are women, and specifically Black women. And the power of just giving people money is, we say, we trust you. And we actually know from some research we've done, it's not just the material benefit. It is a psychological benefit that individuals get when they're not forced to jump through these hoops to demonstrate that they're deserving of the basics. We did one of our big projects was working with Mayor Tubbs in Stockton, California, just to give people $500 a month, no strings attached. And one of the kind of biggest findings is people's health and well-being improved. A number of the participants in the study at the beginning were by definition depressed, and we saw huge shifts in their mental health over that time period. So that's really, for me, what at the heart of it is to say that we the root of this is really not trusting people, and a lot of it having to trusting, again, women, and trusting specifically Black women in the United States, with the kind of long-standing myth of the welfare queen that has shaped decades of social policy. But really, this is the heart of this is building a system built on dignity, and really giving people what they need. And by the way, all of it's backed up by evidence. This isn't just asking people to take a leap of faith. There is true evidence that if you're trying to build a stable society where everyone can thrive, don't make them jump through the hoops. Just give them the basics. And it's amazing what people can build and who they can be in the world. And it's time that we build an equitable future where that future is available to everyone.
Yeah, I really appreciate you answering that. That's incredible. And really innovative, in thinking. I'm sure as women listening to this, we're not surprised in hearing you say that. But I think it's pioneering in that you don't hear at least a lot of the uplifting or the thinking about who deserves, and thinking that in sort of a patriarchal mindset. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. And Sarah, want to come around to you, and then I'm going to grab some questions in the chat. Thank you all for interacting. I'm loving the emojis. Just to sort of recap what's going on here, I'm having a moderated discussion with my three panelists here. We're going to wrap this up with my last question. I had one final question for them, but I do want to grab, I actually had two final questions for them, but I want to grab some in the chat. So let me come around to you, Sarah, with this one last question, and then depending on where we are on time, I can do the around the horn to close us out. So, Sarah, while the American Rescue Plan and other rescue packages helped address immediate health and economic concerns, they were not long-term solutions to many of the pressing challenges facing our nation, as we've been chatting about. So I know you've been doing a lot of housing and justice work lately. Can you share with us some best practices that you've identified on both the federal and state levels?
Sure. So our research team has continuously analyzed the Census Household Pulse Survey data and found that women of color, unsurprisingly, are more likely than white non-Hispanic men to be behind on rent. Black non-Hispanic women have continuously faced the highest rates of being behind on rent. And the COVID-19 pandemic and she-cession really just exacerbated pre-existing gender and racial disparities in the housing landscape. So, for example, also worked with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition to analyze 2019 data. And women of color in particular were 2 times more likely than single white non-Hispanic men to be spending the majority of their income on rent. And so it's no surprise when women of color face stark levels of losing income that, of course, they fell behind on rent. And so what we have to do is have twofold solutions. We certainly have to address the heightened eviction crisis that we're in now by keeping people housed and rehousing those who have already been evicted. Because newsflash, yes, there was a CDC eviction moratorium, but people were still being evicted. And then we have to really create some long-term solutions as sort of an off-ramp to the temporary ones that you mentioned with the rescue plan. Like one of the big programs is emergency rental assistance. Through 2 COVID relief bills, there was $46.5 billion passed. But unfortunately, as of the end of August, states and localities have only spent 17% of it. And so right now we have the opportunity, one, for states and localities to improve their programs. We know that some of the best programs out there are designing it for and with impacted people. And so things like using self-attestation, which is a flexibility Treasury is allowed for proving things like income, COVID-related hardship, and a lease, is really helpful because it may be hard for a number of people to access those documents if they have it at all, especially unhoused people. And so that sort of barrier, design or lack of barriers, is based on, do we trust people? This concern with fraud is really related to what Taylor was sharing about the racist and sexist welfare queen stereotype. And so eliminating those barriers is a key thing. And Treasury actually yesterday just released some reallocation guidance. And so states and localities administering these programs, one, have the ability to pivot and learn lessons from any barriers that they've created. Also want to highlight photo IDs are an unfortunate barrier in many of these programs, which can have a harmful effect on people of color, low-income folks, and trans and non-binary folks who might not be able to get an accurate photo ID. And so that's helpful. Emergency rental assistance can pay for some months of future rent, but it's really not a long-term program. And so that's where we're excited about the Build Back Better Act can actually have some of that. We know that housing choice vouchers, for example, help families only pay 30% of their income on rent. Unfortunately, only 1 in 4 eligible households currently get them. The House Financial Services Committee passed a proposal for $75 billion increase in that program, and that would help nearly 1 million more women access it. And so we're really excited about that aspect and hope that it stays as the reconciliation bill keeps going through Congress. We also know that states have a critical role to play in eviction moratoriums, given that the Supreme Court struck down the CDC eviction moratorium. Also, passing source of income discrimination bans are very critical so that landlords can't refuse to take emergency rental assistance or vouchers, which really adds to this housing insecurity for women of color. And then things like eviction diversion programs and funding right to counsel for evictions is really critical, because we know that landlords very often have representation in eviction court, while tenants very often do not. And eviction court goes by very quickly. And so that's right to counsel is one quick way. And little known fact, the rescue plan actually provides some funding that states and localities can use to fund right to counsel programs. So those are just some of the best practices that we're finding.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. I hope all of our audience and women legislators who are on are furiously taking notes or hopefully supporting the same sort of policies in your own states. I want to, again, grab from Charlita in the Q&A. She's saying housing is necessity and owners have all of the control on costs and increases that are not justified or warranted. So I don't think there's a question here, but I just sort of want to say it in case there's a response or some feedback you want to give here. Developers should be required to include affordable units if they receive any funds from the government. So do we know of any requirements, or is there anywhere legislators can push?
So I'll share that the National Housing Trust Fund is also another key priority we have for Build Back Better, because that actually targets the creation of the supply of deeply affordable housing units. And so right now the supply is greatest at folks who are at 30% of AMI and below. And some of the other tax incentives that are out there, they help middle-class families, but we really need to add that like National Housing Trust Fund dollars that can be used for deeply affordable housing units and get those developers to make those commitments, and not just for the short term, but make sure that there's some long-term housing affordability in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And very quickly, I saw a shout out to Representative Cori Bush, and I just want to add my thanks that she showed up, and this goes to people that need to include people with lived experience. And it was great that she's also an elected official with lived experience of being evicted who led that demonstration on the steps of the Capitol. And so
yes,
thank you so much.
Yes, the importance of policymaking with folks who are impacted. Cannot stress that enough. From Jessica in the chat, I'm going to post this to all of you all or who wants to take it. It says, I think I heard that lack of competition costs American households about $5,000 a year. I'd love to understand more about that. And can you point her to a resource?
I'll jump in first. So Jessica, I posted an article. The statistic $5,000 a year is pulled from a professor at NYU, Thomas Philippon, who essentially did an assessment. It was a quite unique research study in comparing I believe it was the cost of cell phone service in the United States versus France, after France introduced a new carrier and therefore increased the competition in the market, and then kind of pulled that data set and then applied it across different markets and sectors. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting, right? This to me is, we have seen a massive consolidation across industries: agriculture, telecom, the pharmaceutical industry, which had a huge impact on on the way the vaccines have rolled out, and who has access to those. Even ventilators, which, as we know, at the beginning of the pandemic, were a huge deal. They're a huge part of the reason ventilators, we just didn't have enough, was because the hospitals couldn't repair them because of some of the insane rule or regulations that the companies have gotten passed in their favor. So to kind of protect their monopolies on the market. So I think I would say we focus a lot and care a lot about families' bottom lines, but concentrated markets have impact on not just people's pocketbooks, but more broadly our democracy and our overall economy as well. So I think the $5,000 number makes it real for people to understand there are real costs to people, that it's in addition to the fact that you have less money in your pocket and you're paying more for things, it is the fact that the local small and pop businesses in your community can no longer sustain themselves. It is the fact that we have fragile supply lines. It is the fact that farmers can no longer repair their own equipment and have to dedicate more and more of their income to repairing their machine or paying the companies to get new machines. The fact they can't own their own seeds. There's a strategy around building marketplaces that these companies have now put in place, and the Federal Trade Commission, our regulatory agencies fell down the job for a few decades, and really challenging that. And I think right now we're seeing a sea change moment. We have a new FTC commissioner, Lena Khan, who's leading the charge, who wrote a pretty seminal paper on essentially how Amazon was the new railroads and the implications for the resiliency of our economy. And so I think we're in a kind of an exciting moment to see what she can do. I can also say there's a ton of opportunity to tackle monopolies and the impact of concentration at the state level as well. There's a lot of concentration within states that doesn't make it to the federal level or the FTC. I think you see this a lot with hospitals. And there's a huge implication on the labor market. We call it monopsony before. And so essentially decreases the ability of workers to negotiate or to increase their wages. They have fewer options for jobs within areas, which then also decreases their wages. And there's actually regulations and opportunities at the state level that can be pursued to kind of increase competition within states as well, and push back on some of the market protections that these companies have put in place, so they don't have to fear competition and therefore also decrease the quality of their services. So I think there's a ton of it's monopoly power. I think is something it's really come to the forefront of the conversation around the fragility of the economy in the past few years. There's still a ton of work to do there and a lot of education around it. So excited for those of you willing to kind of dig in and what it means for your constituencies.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So a question from Mac. The change in poverty statistics during the pandemic on account of the American Rescue Plan was stark. So how might arguments for universal basic income benefit our understanding of the success of this legislation?
Sure. So I think universal basic income or UBI really is one of the marker proposals out there for getting cash assistance, so that families don't have to worry about weathering a quick financial shock, like maybe there's a big healthcare expense or loss of a job. Taylor kind of alluded to this, but we really do need these long-term cash supports. And unfortunately, things like TANF have been vastly divested. And so there's inadequate supports. I already mentioned sort of the barriers to rental assistance. And while I advocate for universal rental assistance as well, so every family can get that, UBI would certainly have a great impact on that as well. I want to make an important point of wow, I am so excited for the statistics about how poverty levels have been diminished because of great things like the stimulus checks, monthly child tax credit payments. I also want to say that our current measure of poverty is inadequate. And so, yes, we've made progress, but we need to do more because people who are living at the federal poverty level don't actually have what they need to be economically insecure, to make sure that they can keep housing, a roof over their heads, food on the tables. And so it's very much a yes, and let's celebrate the progress, continue to invest and look for ways to provide cash assistance as well as other critical supports. But also there's a good conversation that needs to be had about adjusting that federal poverty level.
Just to jump in on that, I would say kind of two big things. One, I would encourage, there's a paper by Dr. Derek Hamilton at the New School, who recently wrote what I think is probably the most impactful version of a guaranteed income or basic income at the federal level. It's structured as a negative income tax. We're really careful and care very deeply about implementing a version of these programs where you're not adding to the concentration of wealth. And there's certain versions of UBI where if you don't get the pay for right, you could actually end up exacerbating the racial wealth gap. And so Dr. Derek Hamilton took a very race equity forward approach to designing his version of a guaranteed income. So I'd really direct folks to check that out. And there's all kinds of, I think, advocacy work over the long term. I would also say we're in a fight right now for a guaranteed income for children and families. The CTC is effectively that provides an income floor for parents with young kids. Right now, because of our austerity thinking and trying to push the overall number down the package, we potentially risk losing some of the most transformative aspects of that, which is the permanent refundability, I-10 filer being a part of it, and kind of overall increasing the number. So, in as much as anyone on this call is willing to get on the phone to call your senator and congressperson and really emphasize the importance of the CTC, which again cut childhood poverty in half, the temporary version that we put in place, that is a real actionable thing that could be transformative. It's would be one of the most transformative social policies we've passed in a few decades. I would also say there's a ton of potential to do work at the state level. States don't have the budgets to sustain a full-on guaranteed income, but we do have state level EITCs, and those EITCs can be transformed or reformed or improved to include more people who are currently left out of it. One of the big visions behind a guaranteed income is not forcing people to prove their worth to be able to have the basis covered. The EITC is currently attached to work. It's really hard, I think, to move people all the way from taking out the work requirements, but there is concrete things you can do to include caregivers and students, who are two populations who have extremely high poverty rates or extremely often unstable, do phenomenal services to society, yet currently aren't eligible for the EITC. So there is state level work as well to essentially move some of our current policies and programs to look more like a guaranteed income and therefore be really transformative for folks who are currently left out.
Incredible examples. Thank you both for that. The last question I see, at least right now for the chat, and then maybe we'll have some time for my around the horn, from Maggie: how do state representatives change the narrative that the economy is just spontaneous to their constituents? Are there any messaging tips that you all would recommend? Whoever wants to jump in on that one. I'm guessing we're thinking here, and Maggie, if you're still on, you can feel free to add if I'm not saying this right. I'm guessing we're thinking that so many times, I guess representatives will try to blame the spontaneity of the economy versus actual fiscal policies maybe being the problem here. And so how can we sort of message to counter that? Or what have you seen that can be sort of strong?
So I'll say this is a really hard nut to crack. So one of the things that I think there's a lot of folks working on, and where we've learned a lot from others on this, is for a lot of us who really are attracted to doing policy and political change work, our advocacy lens is how can we move legislation? But I think the thing that we've missed for a long time, and I think there's been transformative work often led by folks on the front lines, is taking a step back and saying, what is the water we're all actually swimming in? What are the belief systems and mental models that tell us what is or is not possible? I think, just an example for that, I think this crowd would be really familiar with is the idea that national security is military might, is an example of an intellect or an ideas paradigm that shapes what we think and how we do the work that we do. And I think on the economic work, that is, the idea of the economy, the invisible hand argument was an intentional political program on the right, pushed over decades to change, to really appeal to people's base senses about what was or was not possible, what is ideal, what is not ideal when it comes to kind of role of government within the economy. So I think there's part of it's taking a step back and asking, how are we reinforcing that message in our culture, in our narratives and our stories, and then how are we putting alternatives forward? So I think there's a ton of tremendous work happening to tell that different story. And part of it is transparency on how does people make decisions? Like, who's lobbying? Like, if corporations actually don't believe the market just works the way it does, why are they regulating so hard to get regulations? Or sorry, why are they advocating so hard to get regulations that make it easier for them to earn a profit, right? Telling that story, I think, is one example where you can push back against that. I think really, focusing in on the impact that social programs can have is another example of showing that government can make a difference and changes the way that markets can or cannot work for people. So I think narratives and storytelling has to be a part of our toolbox if we're going to open up the space more for people to hear there's to have different belief systems around this stuff. And I just to give you another example, I think we have a tremendous set of legislators who've helped done that, even though they sit kind of in that policy advocacy realm. I think Cori Bush is telling different stories about how the system works and changing people's minds and opening them up to a different way. And I think that's the thing is you can talk about this stuff in theory, but the real lived experience of people about how that system is failing them and how it can be different, you can't replace that. And so I think the more that we find those champions and lift up their voices and experiences and telling those stories and narratives to shift the culture, will create a more conducive context for all of us to push for the world that we want to live in.
Yeah, for sure. I just to say a bit about that, when we think about the fight that's going on in Congress, this is the same fight that's been going on. This is the last big fight that I remember was how we arrived at the BCA, the Budget Control Act, because we just refused to reallocate funding from the defense to non-defense programs. And there is this idea that those who, can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps aren't deserving of getting help. So yeah, it's disheartening to think we're almost a decade away from that. And we're still having the same conversation, but knowing that I'm in the fight with you all and everyone on the call, I'm sure we could make a lot of good work. So
if I can just add on that, they're not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. You need to look at things like how many subsidies they're getting. Good Jobs First has a great subsidy tracker. Look at, the major businesses in your community and how they're being disproportionately advantaged. There is all this corporate welfare that is occurring. The system, unfortunately, President Trump did kind of have some of his analysis was correct. There are a lot of ways that the system is rigged against ordinary people. What we need to do is that we are then pivoting to solutions for how we're actually going to help make people's lives better.
Absolutely. 100%, Mandy. So I'm actually going to start with you with this, my last around the horn. If folks have other questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. I think I've answered everything that's in there now. We are wrapping the panel at 12:25, so we only have about 7 minutes. So get your question in. So my last around the horn was, bringing us back to the topic, economic security is national security. When you think about economic security, what does that mean for you, Mandy? And then we'll hear from everyone.
I do really think it's about resilience. It's about enabling people to live the lives that they want to live, something that we haven't been able to spend as much time on in this conversation, but I would like to flag too is that there's a lot of work we need to do on democracy reform as well. So we make sure that we have a government that is representative of us. We have talked a lot about the many ways that corporations have a disproportionate seat at the table. So I think that it needs to be part of the equation too. How do we make our voices heard and impactful? And I'm so glad to be in the fight with all of you.
Absolutely. You next, Sarah.
So following on, Mandy, definitely think that economic security is about people having what they need, and not just for basic things, but to live with dignity and opportunity. It includes having a stable income for sure and adequate nutrition, but also fair access to affordable and accessible housing. And that includes having the autonomy to choose whether you want to rent or own a home, because we know so many racist and sexist policies have blocked women of color from home ownership. So that's important, as well as opportunities to build savings and wealth so that we can change that statistic about how many people in the United States can weather a $400 financial shock. We need to bring that down to or up to 100%. And we also know, as we've kind of stated throughout this, is that economic security, we have to change that narrative. It is a policy choice, not a personal choice. So when we center gender and racial justice to improve our economic systems, that improves the outlook for women of color and other multiply marginalized folks like LGBTQ people, people with disabilities who for far too often have been intentionally or sometimes just the impact of sort of race neutral policies that have a disparate impact on people of color, women, people with disabilities, and have been sort of pushed out of the economic systems. And so when we center them, that's where we for all.
And Taylor, quickly, I want to grab Edie's question. She has a great question in the chat. I want to pose that to you all before we end. You're muted.
Recently on is bound to happen at one point. I really want to reclaim the word freedom and like, what does it mean to live freely? And I think we've built that for some people and not for others. And to me, that's what stability is. It's, and I think this, you see this, I think in other sectors, it's like the root of reproductive justice. It's the freedom of choice to like build that life and to thrive. That is different for every single person, and in which we can build a society where your race and your gender identity, your abilities don't shape the ability to choose those lives. Like that is true economic security in the most expansive form for me.
For sure. Yay, ladies. Thank you so much. So with Edie's question, this will probably take us to the close. Can anyone comment on the privatization of public services such as water, the post office, and schools? That is a great question. And I guess how that affects, income security, economic security, especially on the privatization of water.
I can start a little bit. I think my colleagues are going to have even smarter things to say, but I think what we're really talking about is increasing the cost of providing basic services to people, undermining confidence in government and the ability for us to be able to help each other. And it's something that I think we all need to be pushing back on a lot more aggressively than we have been, because it's making it that much harder to have human security.
Agreed.
And I'll also add that privatization takes away rights. So when we talk about privatization of schools, there are various rights that you have in public school that you won't have in private school. You have to waive those away. I can't speak to water, but I do know that, for example, with the Farm Bill, we fought away attempts to try to privatize like SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, application processes. This comes up a lot. When really, yes, it can be more costly to contract those out, but also you lose some of the great benefits in it. I would also add there are some key worker protections that are very helpful when you keep these critical public services inside the government.
And I'll just plus everything said, and I would say it's a huge equity issue as well. I think we ignore our history about what has been often the driver pulling people into the middle class. It's government jobs, and it's a public sector that's accountable to a greater mandate than just profit, and we lose that with privatization. So I think it's understanding that is not just about. First of all, probably most often than not decreases the quality of services, but it is about a broader idea of, again, how we create spaces for people to thrive.
Absolutely. This was such a fascinating conversation. I'm kind of upset that I was moderating because I was focused on sort of the next thing. I'm going to sit back later and listen and watch and take my own notes, because there was some gems that were dropped here this morning and this afternoon, ladies. So thank you so much for taking your time, for kicking us off for our Fund Communities Build Security. This is our very first panel. To those in the audience, this panel was Economic Security is National Security. It will be provided in the recordings tab by the end of the week. All of our sessions will be there for you to view again, or to share if you'd like to share some of the great things that were said here, and have your friends and colleagues check it out. We were joined today by Taylor Jo Isenberg. She's the Executive Director at the Economic Security Project, Mandy Smithberger, the Director of the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO, and Sarah Hassmer, the Senior Counsel for Income Security at the National Women's Law Center. So thank you all for joining us. We'll have a short 5-minute break here, and then we will come back and we'll have a presentation on Follow the Federal Money. Really pertinent, I guess, after this conversation from Cassandra Varenka at Foreign Policy for America.